To me, there is a very interesting example, and that is the example of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These are 10 countries, more or less the same population as Latin America, I think 650 million or so. Some of them quite small, Cambodia, Laos, Brunei, others, Indonesia is very big, but some of them are quite small. And yet they work together, both in terms of regional economic integration and in terms of political cooperation. They have been extremely successful from a diplomatic point of view. And the ASEAN summits are attended by the President of the United States, the President of Russia, the President of China. They have an extraordinary drawing power, which Latin American meetings certainly don't have, and neither do African meetings. So why have they succeeded? Because they work together, despite their ideological differences. Vietnam is a communist country, one-party state. So is Laos. Singapore is very different. Thailand is very different. Indonesia is very different. Yet they work together because they realize that they are all in the same boat. So that example, it seems to me, is very relevant and should be relevant for Latin America.
Good evening, everyone. Our focus tonight is Latin America, a region that has seen significant changes over the past few years, changes that could result in a significant shift in that region's relationship with the United States. Consider the recent elections in Colombia, Chile, and Brazil, where left-leaning governments have been voted in. These developments in Latin America follow years of economic stagnation, a situation that went from bad to worse with the onslaught of the pandemic. That hit Latin America particularly hard. It's been estimated that the region sustained 30% of the world's COVID-related deaths, even though it accounts for 8% of the world's population. And of course, during that period, the U.S. experienced an unprecedented number of immigrants from some of the hardest hit countries in the region. On May 11th, all eyes were on our southern border as the lifting of Title 42 marked the end of pandemic-era rules and a new set of regulations came into force. For the time being, the new rules under Title 8 have not resulted in the huge surge of asylum-seeking immigrants that was predicted. But these rules are now being challenged in the courts, and more than 25,000 migrants are reportedly in a holding pattern in Mexico. So it's yet to be seen whether the current lull is in fact the calm before the storm. While many in the U.S. are rightfully concerned about the events taking place at the southern border, these events are just a small part of the problem. To understand the current situation, we need to take a hard look at how we got to this point with our neighbors to the south. We also need to consider U.S. relations with Latin America in the broader context of an increasingly polarized world, at a time when China is making significant investments in Latin America and negotiating free trade agreements with countries in the region. So how will all of this play out? Will new leadership in key South American governments lead to greater cooperation and integration within the region? Can South American and Caribbean countries successfully pursue a strategy of active non-alignment? These issues are complex and there are many moving parts. Our distinguished speaker this evening will share his thoughts on these and other key issues. My name is Anne LaFrance, and I'm a member of the WorldBoston Board of Directors. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Great Decisions program. We're delighted that you're joining us, whether here at the Boston Public Library or virtually on Zoom. To start off, we want to thank the Lowell Institute, which generally supports our Great Decisions series. Thanks also to our production partners at GBH Forum Network, who are making it possible for our virtual audience to join us tonight. So now, without further ado, let me turn to tonight's speaker, Ambassador Jorge Heine. For the sake of time, I'll abbreviate his very impressive biography, but you can read it in full on our website. Ambassador Heine is a lawyer, international relations scholar, and diplomat with a special interest in the international politics of the Global South. He is a research professor at the Frederick S. Pardee School for Global Studies at Boston University and interim director of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. He is also currently a non-resident global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, and an honorary visiting professor of international relations at the University of Sichuan in Chengdu. He served as ambassador of Chile to China from 2014 to 17, to India from 2003 to 2007, to South Africa from 1995 to 1999, and as a cabinet minister in the Chilean government. Ambassador Heine is frequently interviewed by international media and has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the International Herald Tribune. He has written over 100 journal articles and chapters and is the author of 15 books, including most recently, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. He has recently been awarded by Boston University the Adel Najam Prize for advancing the public understanding of global affairs. Ambassador, congratulations on your book and the prize, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I turn the program over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for those very kind words. Well, in the first place, let me thank WorldBoston, and especially its head, Mary Intema, for the kind invitation to speak at this magnificent venue that is the Boston Public Library, which I frequently visit. Very shortly after my arrival in Boston in September of 2019, Mary Intema very kindly invited me to attend the WorldBoston functions and offered me the opportunity to give a lecture like this at this venue in March of 2020. You may recall what happened, and unfortunately that could not take place. But I am delighted that I had a second chance, a second shot at it, and here I am with a different topic, with a different subject, but here nonetheless. And let me also say that I feel a special link with the WorldBoston's parent organization, the Foreign Policy Association based in New York. They published my second book some 40 years ago. I have 17 books by now. So that second book is particularly fond a memory of mine, and I owe it to the Foreign Policy Association. I always tell my students that timing isn't everything, it's the only thing. And in fact, yesterday, we had the first South American diplomatic summit in 10 years. So this was held in Brasilia, called by President Lula of Brazil. There were 11 presidents in attendance. The only president that couldn't attend was the president of Peru, who Peru is right now. But the hope is that this will open a new stage in South American regional integration and political cooperation. The leadership that President Lula has shown so far gives us hope that things may turn for the better after a very difficult few years. As Anne said, and I'll come back to this, in 2020, Latin America had the worst economic performance in 120 years, with a downturn in GDP of 6.6% in a year when global GDP fell by 3.3%. So Latin America was twice the global fall of GDP, which gives you an idea of how bad things were. And the region still hasn't fully recovered. Some projections indicate there might be negative economic growth this year, at a time when a number of Asian countries say are growing at 6%. So the region is by no means out of the woods. But what I would like to start with is not talking strictly about Latin America. I know you have broad interests. What I would like to do to start with is to put Latin America's position in the world political economy, so that we have some sense of what is happening in the region, how that relates to the broader picture that we see. And here, there's some fascinating insights into how world politics works. We just had, as you may recall, the meeting of the G7 in Hiroshima, and the Japanese government very purposefully looking at this troubled world, and some people say there might be a danger of nuclear war, decided to hold the meeting in Hiroshima to remind us all how tragic nuclear weapons, the effect of nuclear weapons can be. And you look at the pictures and the coverage, and it all looked very cozy, and people talk about the unity and resolve of the G7 on Ukraine and on other topics, and how encouraging this was. But what got lost in all of this highly fulsome coverage is that the G7 represents 770 million people. That is less than 10% of the total population of the world. In fact, if we look at GDP in PPP terms and purchasing power parity, the BRICS countries have a larger GDP than the G7. So it is important to put these things in perspective. The world, can no longer be run by a few North Atlantic nations. They just can't cope. Yet somehow there is this pretense that it can be done. And let me tell you a little story. There's no reason why you should have heard about it, but I did. The G7, in fact, may not even exist at this point if something had not happened in Pittsburgh in September of 2009. As you may recall, the G20 was created in 2008 at the height of the financial crisis, and President Bush called a meeting of the G20 at leaders level in the White House to see how to cope with the financial crisis that was really getting out of hand, in the worst global financial crisis since the Great Depression. And in the meeting held in Pittsburgh almost a year later, President Obama says, now that we have the G20, we really don't need the G7, G8 at the time. So why don't we dispense with it and continue to work with the G20, which is a much more representative entity, with India, China, South Africa, Australia, many other countries that make it a much more representative body. And the reason this did not happen is because in this group, one of the leaders raised their hand. This was Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada. And he raised the following objection. He said, well, you see, next year we are organizing the G7. And we have already made all sorts of preparations. And I would really like to be there. So let us not do this. Now, you realize the way these important policy decisions are made. So this was for an administrative, bureaucratic reason. The G7 continued to exist and exists to this day. Now, projections, if we look ahead, projections indicate that by 2050, the top 3 economies in the world will be China, India, and the United States, in that order. And let me go back a little bit here. So here is the graph of how the GDP of the BRICS has surpassed, in PPP terms, that of the G7. You can see this here as well. The graph on the left is in PPP terms. The graph on the right is in market prices. But the trends are unmistakable in which direction the world is going. And here is the projection for the top 10 economies in 2050, the situation today and the situation in 2050 with 7 of the top 10 economies in the world being non-Western. So, you know, I always tell my students that the reason Lionel Messi, the Argentine soccer player, is such a good player is not because he knows where the ball is now. He is such a good player because he knows where the ball is going to be 5 seconds from now. You know? And so to understand the world, it is important for us to understand not just where we are today, but also where we'll be, you know, a couple of decades from now. And it seems to me these are the kinds of graphs, these are the kinds of data that we need to keep in mind in that regard. Very well. Okay. Now, this is why, you know, the World Bank speaks of a wealth shift. In 2015, the World Bank came with a fascinating report. You should look it up. And they argued that the most significant economic development that has taken place in the past 20 years is the shift from the North Atlantic to the Asia-Pacific in terms of where the wealth is and where the wealth is generated. Another little piece of information I share with my students, and they are, you know, quite shocked. There are more billionaires in Beijing today than there are in New York City. Now, that figure itself, it seems to me, is quite revealing as to, you know, what is happening. So Gerard Araud, the former French ambassador to the United States, has spoken about this in a different context, but his phrase is, the Western moment is over. If we look at these figures, if we look at these graphs, we will realize why that is the case. And at a time when the world is especially troubled, we need new ways of thinking about how to move forward and cope with this international scenario. And what we argue in this book of us that came out in February, published in London by Anthem Press, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the active non-alignment option, is that active non-alignment provides a way forward for, not just for Latin America, but also for countries in Africa and in Asia. That it provides a compass, a guide to action that the developing world needs to navigate these difficult waters. Now, what is interesting is that when we brought out, we originally published this notion, put it forward in 2020, and then published a book in Spanish on the subject. We received quite a bit of criticism, and people said, you know, this is old wine in new bottles. You know, who cares about non-alignment? This is stuff from the 1950s and 60s. We now live in the age of AI, you know, cloud computing. Who cares about these notions from yesteryear? Well, and then something happened in Ukraine in February of last year. And suddenly, Western countries found that, well, many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America didn't share the perspective of NATO, of the G7. Most prominently, India. India had become relatively close to the United States. Prime Minister Modi, who will visit now again in June, had visited the United States. He got along famously well with President Trump. They had a grand event in a Houston stadium. Prime Minister Modi invited President Trump to India with another grand event at the stadium in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad. India joined the Quad, this entity with Japan, Australia, and the United States. And a lot of people assumed that India would side with the G7, with NATO, with the West. Well, it didn't, and has stayed studiously neutral on the war in Ukraine. And something similar has happened with a number of other countries in the global south. Pakistan, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. So this raised many eyebrows. People said, how is this possible? How can these countries, these are some of the biggest democracies in the world, if, as some Western governments have said, the war in Ukraine will show that the main cleavage in today's world is between democracy and autocracy. And whoever backs NATO and Ukraine is for democracy. And those who don't are for autocracy. Well, India is the biggest democracy in the world. It has not supported Ukraine. So is Indonesia, so is Pakistan, so is Brazil. So there is a problem. There's a puzzle. How do you explain this? Why is this happening? Why aren't all these countries running to support the position of the G7 and of NATO on the war in Ukraine? And one explanation is that, well, they are insecure. They don't know what to do. They are ambivalent. Others have talked of a moral failure of not taking the right stance in a war that is basically pitting good against evil. And what we say is that that is not the case at all. That what these countries are doing is they are following a policy of active non-alignment, and that is many of these countries do in fact condemn the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the tremendous suffering it has inflicted on the Ukrainian people, which we see every evening on our television screens. What they do not agree on is to make this European war into a global war, which is why they have not supported sanctions, economic and diplomatic sanctions on Russia, and that are basically an attempt to do this. And that has been the main issue at hand. It is not a question of not condemning the Russian invasion, which they do, but the question then becomes, well, why is this war that is taking place in Europe so unique that it has to be made into a global war? There are many wars. There was a war in Yemen, there have been many wars in Africa, in Asia, and so on. But this is the first occasion in which the attempt is being made to make it into a global war, in which all 200 countries have to side with Ukraine and actively boycott in various ways Russia. And there's a wonderful sentence by the foreign minister of India, a remarkable man, Mr. Jaishankar, who put it in a way that it seems to me no other statesman has put it. He said, "The time is long past when Europe could believe that Europe's problems were the world's, but the world's problems were not Europe's." By this he meant that the war in Ukraine is a European war and should remain that way, contrary to the efforts that have been made to make it into a global war. In that sense, the position that Latin American countries like Brazil, like Mexico, like Argentina have taken in complex ways. Sometimes foreign ministries will vote one way in the United Nations, but the president of Mexico will say something else. In Argentina, something similar, in Brazil as well. But the basic message has been that some of the leading countries in Latin America will not support sanctions on Russia. The only country in Latin America that has supported sanctions on Russia is Costa Rica. No other country has done so, for the reasons that I have just mentioned. And there's this sense that this rules-based order that is being invoked is one that, in fact, has not favored countries in the global south. That the Western powers have been mostly concerned with keeping primacy, of being top dog, of benefiting from the existing order, but that they haven't really contributed to promote, to defend, to expand global public goods. And the most egregious example of that is, of course, the pandemic. Worst pandemic in 100 years, and yet what role did the great powers play? This is something that originated in China, which botched it very much at the beginning, although later tried to fix it. We all know what happened in the United States. We all know what happened in the United Kingdom. We all know about vaccine nationalism, in which many Western countries refused to provide vaccines in time for countries around the global south. And so the notion that somehow countries in the global south should be enthralled at defending this rules-based order that hasn't really stood up for them is something that has evoked tremendous criticism. And that is why so many countries in the global south have taken the stance that they have taken on the war in Ukraine. So what I would like to posit to you is that this notion that we have put forth, and that this choice that was put is really the argument being made that somehow the war in Ukraine would show that the main cleavage in the world is between democracy and autocracy. We argue that is not the case. What it has done is shown that the main cleavage is between North and South. And the attitude that we have seen, the reaction of countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, has been quite non-committal in terms of what the G7 has tried to extract from them on the war in Ukraine. So the basic proposition here is that active non-alignment is about countries putting their own interests front and center, not siding either with Washington or Beijing or Moscow or Brussels, but rather promoting their own interests. Now, this is much more difficult. It's much easier to do as you are told. But if you have to evaluate each decision that you make in foreign policy, I was ambassador for 12 years, so I know this very well. When you have to evaluate each decision on its own merits and make a choice, that is much more demanding of your analytical and decision-making capabilities. And that is what active non-alignment demands. You don't side automatically with one or the other of the great powers, but you make those choices on a one-by-one basis, and that is how you move forward. This is also something that demands considerable regional cooperation, and as I said earlier, I hope that the meeting in Brasilia, first diplomatic summit in South America in 10 years, may lead to greater cooperation. The region has been tremendously fragmented. To give you an idea, one of the first things that President Bolsonaro of Brazil did when he was elected was to have Brazil leave CELAC. CELAC is the leading regional organization, umbrella organizations of Latin American countries. And this has led to a very diminished position of Latin America in world affairs, something that is often not known. Today, I think there are 16 UN agencies, not a single one is headed by a Latin American. This had never happened in a very long time. You all know, of course, of the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum used to have a Latin American chapter. They have an Asian chapter, they have an African chapter. They used to have a Latin American, they closed it because there was no interest in it. So these are the things that tell you how bad things have gotten to be in Latin America and why a different approach is needed to rescue the region that has been moving, as we put it in the book, from the periphery to the other margins. And what is remarkable is that after all the criticism we originally got for postulating something that seemed to be from the past 70 years ago, something as anachronistic as active non-alignment, suddenly non-alignment is all over the place. As you can see, a cover story in The Economist, a collection of pieces in Foreign Policy, the cover of Foreign Affairs, that venerable journal, more than 100 years now, and they all coming to terms with this re-emergence of non-alignment. Non-alignment wasn't dead, after all, as many argued that it was. It has come back to life in a new incarnation as active non-alignment. And here are some figures that have been mentioned on the pandemic and how hard Latin America was hit, as Anne mentioned, with 8% of the world's population, it had 30% of the world's death. There are a number of reasons for it, but at least one was there was no cooperation among countries. It was each one for himself, making it very difficult to cope with such a difficult situation. And so what is active non-alignment all about? It is not neutrality. Neutrality is what Switzerland did when they decided not to join the UN, not to join the EU, and have no opinion on things. No. Active non-alignment doesn't mean that. It may very well be that on some issues, countries that take the active non-alignment position will be closer to the United States, say on democracy or human rights. On other issues, they may be closer to China, say on international trade. But that is something that will vary. The basic point is to have a nimble diplomacy that evaluates each issue on its own. And often people will ask me, what is the difference between non-alignment in its traditional version in the 60s and 70s and with active non-alignment today. And what is important to understand, and that is why I prefaced my remarks with the changes that we have seen in the world political economy, is that now we don't have the third world of yesteryear that was basically formed by very poor countries that didn't have much to offer, and therefore resorted to what was known as the diplomatie de cahiers de doléances, which is basically grievance diplomacy. We have been exploited, we want money, give us reparations. That was the basic message of the new international economic order, which needless to say didn't work. Nothing happened. What we have today is a very different situation with countries like China, like India, the ASEAN nations, having enormous resources, and also countries like Brazil and others. And therefore, they are in a very different situation. You have entities like the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, like the New Development Bank. And therefore, countries in the Global South can do business with their own, South-to-South trade, South-to-South FDI, which was not obviously possible in the 70s and 80s. So you have two things here. You have, on the one hand, the shift in wealth that the World Bank talks about, with the Asia-Pacific becoming very much the center of dynamism in economic growth. And these resources become available for, the rest of the Global South. And then you have the change in diplomacy as countries are able to interact with others from a very different basis. And I particularly underscore the change from the diplomacy of the cahier de doléances, which is grievance diplomacy, to collective financial statecraft practiced with these new international financial entities like the AIIB and the NDB. India, again, very much at the center of things. India, in many ways, holds the balance of power in the world because it is in the middle. It is a country that has been growing at very high rates in the past decades. And obviously, it doesn't side either with the United States or with China in this competition and tries to keep the balance. And in the case of the war in Ukraine, that has been very much the case. And finally, and I'm getting messages that my time is up, so I will wrap up quickly. People will often say, well, all of this is a very nice theory. But is anybody actually doing this? What does this mean in practice? And, well, President Lula, here you see him with President Biden in his recent visit to Washington. You see him on a teleconference call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. And you see him here during his recent visit to China, meeting with President Xi Jinping. And a lot of people thought that President Lula, once elected, would focus strictly on domestic issues, and he certainly has a plate full of domestic issues he has to tend to. Brazil was one of the countries most affected by the pandemic, 700,000 deaths from the pandemic. I think second country in the world after the United States with most deaths. So, lots of things on his plate. But, contrary to that common wisdom, he has put his foreign policy of efforts front and center. And he is keen to bring peace to Ukraine. Now, some people say, well, why should a Latin American country do this? And, well, Brazil is a big country. And, there is no reason why it shouldn't be able to engage in these issues. Now, he's found opposition. Some people do not necessarily want peace negotiations. They want the war to go on. But he is committed to that. We'll see what happens. But in any case, he cannot be accused of not trying. And what makes it possible for him to do this is because he has been, non-aligned. He wouldn't have, if he had sided with one of the two parties, he wouldn't have the credibility to mediate. And here's where the people ask me, well, what does the active part in active non-alignment mean? Well, it means you take the initiative and you try to make things happen. And that is exactly what President Lula has been doing. So, I would like to think, and I hope you agree with me, that active non-alignment is resonating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I wish we had a lot more time for your direct remarks because it's a fascinating subject. I'm sure we have a lot of questions in the audience and also online, but let me start off with one, since I have the prerogative. There's an old African proverb that when elephants fight, it's the grass underneath that suffers.
Sure.
And I just wondered, in terms of the actual practice beyond, as you were giving the Lula example, trying to play an active role in the whole Ukraine situation. Is there a need for both regional integration and you were mentioning financial statecraft within the global South? Does that form a pretty important dimension of the success of this active non-alignment concept? I mean, can individual countries really stand up to these two or three powerful players if they actually start to, force the issue without banding together? Sure.
No, that's a great question. And the answer is, obviously, you are in a much stronger position if you're able to, stand together and therefore, present some sort of, united front to the big powers. And here, it seems to me, there is a very interesting example, and that is the example of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. These are 10 countries, more or less the same population as Latin America, I think 650 million or so. Some of them quite small, Cambodia, Laos, Brunei, others, Indonesia is very big, but some of them are quite small. And yet, they work together, both in terms of regional economic integration and in terms of political cooperation. They have been extremely successful from a diplomatic point of view. And the ASEAN summits are attended by the President of the United States, the President of Russia, the President of China. They have an extraordinary drawing power, which, Latin American meetings certainly don't have, and neither do African meetings. So why have they succeeded? Because they work together, despite their ideological differences. Vietnam is a communist country, one-party state. So is Laos. Singapore is very different. Thailand is very different. Indonesia is very different. Yet they work together because they realize that they are all in the same boat. So that example, it seems to me, is very relevant and should be relevant for Latin America.
All right, let's move to audience questions. I see one over there, and wait for the mic, please.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask two questions. I'm just going to condense them into one. Thinking about active non-alignment, I was really heartened by your mention of President Lula. And, I recall this one interview he had with Christian Amanpour sometime earlier this year that really brought to life how active non-alignment actually happens in real life. I wanted to focus on the Caribbean and CARICOM in particular. And I noticed that, especially in the case of Barbados, Prime Minister Mia Mottley has been also a really key figure in sort of acting out in this sort of active non-alignment strategy. But what's been going on in CARICOM has been particularly troubling for a number of people who've been watching the area, thinking about different rifts that's been happening between Jamaica and a couple other countries as well, and coordination problems within that regional organization. How do you sort of see active non-alignment operating, or how can it sort of imperil regional coordination strategies if it does? Interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, thank you. Great question. And let me say the following. I started my academic career, in Caribbean studies. The Caribbean is a region that is very close to my heart. And in our book, Jorge Castañeda, a leading analyst and former foreign secretary of Mexico, he makes the case that active non-alignment is more suited for South American countries, which are bigger and less dependent on the United States. And they export a lot of commodities to China, and that gives them the sort of leverage that the smaller countries in the Caribbean and in Central America do not have. And so his argument is that active non-alignment may be much more feasible for South American countries like, say, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, than it would be for, say, Barbados or Jamaica or Guyana. And obviously, there's something to the argument, and these countries in the Caribbean are much more closely integrated in terms of tourism, in terms of production, even in terms of sports, with the United States than countries, say, in the southern cone are. Now, that said, though, let us recall that in the 1970s and 80s, Caribbean leaders like Michael Manley, like Maurice Bishop, like Chetty Yagan, played a very important role in the non-aligned movement. So the notion that, and their structural dependency on the United States was then the same as it is today. So there's an interesting twist there that we ought to keep in mind. And let us recall the following. Now, when the Summit of the Americas took place and in Los Angeles, and the United States decided not to invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, the original stance of CARICOM was, we are not going to go to Los Angeles if this is the case. And it took quite a bit of arm twisting for that not to happen, although in the end, several Caribbean countries and a number of Central American countries and Mexico didn't go to Los Angeles at the presidential or head of government level. So I hear what you say, but it seems to me the situation is a bit more complex. And I would argue that even for the smaller Caribbean countries, there is room for active non-alignment.
I see two more. Oh, wow, lots of questions. I'll leave it to May to select the closest one, maybe. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Just a little background about myself. I'm an international relations grad student from Northeastern University. And this is actually a question that I have, and it's also a question that is on the minds of a few of my classmates who couldn't be here, unfortunately. What would you recommend for an international relations student who does not want to necessarily be an ambassador or a diplomat of their own state? What would you give them as a...
It's a career path, is that what you're asking? Yes.
What are some of the tips that you could give them?
Well, let me tell you a little story. I was a law student, and I was about 20 years old, and at the University of Chile Law School. And somebody told me that there was a place called the Institute of International Studies of the University of Chile, where they discussed matters like, wars in the Middle East, dependency theory, regional integration in Southeast Asia. And I said to myself, well, that sounds very interesting. So I went to these seminars. And when in the morning I took classes in tax law and administrative law, and then in the afternoon I listened to these theorists of war and peace. I said, when I grow up, I want to be like them. And that is what I have done. And what I'm trying to say is that there are tremendous career opportunities in international affairs. Diplomacy obviously is one. There are NGOs of various kinds. There is business. Business needs people that speak languages, that are comfortable in a different environment and that can solve problems. So I would argue that international affairs, if you want to understand the world, opens many possibilities. Now, that said, it's important to keep in mind the following. A BA is no longer what it was. And basically, you need a graduate degree to be able to make any headway, either in diplomacy or international organizations or in NGOs or in business.
I think we have an online question. Natalie?
Thank you. I'm reading a question from Zoom from Roger Falcon. What are your thoughts regarding the notion of multi-alignment as recently proposed to understand world affairs in Foreign Affairs magazine?
Yes, a great question. Thank you. I heard that notion in India and elsewhere. And, I realize that some people have difficulty with the notion of non-alignment because of the baggage it carries or allegedly carries. My own view is that there's nothing wrong with history and that you might as well use historical terms but adapt them to current circumstances. So the notion of multi-alignment, it seems to me, is fine as far as it goes. But it seems to me it really doesn't go to the heart of the matter. My own sense, it's a bit of a cop-out.
I see Heather has a question. Why don't we give her a chance?
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Ambassador. A question and a small comment. Could you please help us understand the structural combination of the non-aligned option with in multilateral alliances particularly bringing the Quad together with a Quad and AUKUS together with the non-aligned option.
And the BRICS, on the other hand.
And the BRICS. How would you align all of those? And perhaps a small bit of pushback about India. Modi is today in Australia, on his way back to Washington in a couple of weeks, very soon. Perhaps it's, and energy security and the need for oil seems to be a reason for not siding with the U.S. and most of the world in the Ukraine conflict. So I was wondering if you might comment on that part of India's role. Thank you so much.
Sure. No, thank you. Great question, Heather, and thank you for coming. I will say this. It's a very complex world, you know. In the old non-alignment of yesteryear, the basic notion was that, you know, you couldn't engage in military alliances with any of the superpowers. I mean, that was sort of the defining element. You wouldn't be in a military alliance either with the Soviet Union or with the United States, and that is what defined non-alignment in many ways. Now, today we live in a much more complex scenario. And thus you have the Indian paradox, you know, part of the Quad, which, you know, some people refer to it as an Asian NATO. I think that's somewhat exaggerated, but it's still very much, you know, a military grouping in which India takes a very active part, participates in military exercises and so on. And at the same time, India has taken the stance that it has taken. I would say that history has a certain weight. And it seems to me India obviously gave birth to the notion of non-alignment. Prime Minister Nehru was very much the brain and the driving force behind it. But, you know, there is also history, and India is a fascinating case because, you know, public opinion polls tell us that Indian public opinion is among the most pro-US anywhere in the world. Yet Indian elites remember that in their 3 wars with Pakistan, the United States always supported Pakistan. So now when they are asked to support the United States against, you know, the successor state of the Soviet Union, Russia, well, they have certain qualms and say, well, why should we? So I wouldn't say it's just an energy question. There's also a question of defense equipment, but there's also a question of history.
Other questions from the audience? Can we have the mic down here?
You are the wonderful speaker, so logical and reasonable. What do you served in the 3 best progressive countries as ambassador? What do you expect tomorrow from BRICS in South Africa? Tomorrow, June 1st and 2nd, BRICS is there.
Yes.
30% of the world is there.
Sure. Yes. You know, I was in South Africa in March, and there was a lot of speculation as what would happen with the BRICS meeting. And, you know, the BRICS are here to stay. Members of the BRICS grouping, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, feel very strong about it. They think it is a group that, you know, is very significant for them. And they are not going to let it fall. So the BRICS has become a very significant reference point. And South Africa will make sure they have this meeting of foreign ministers, and later on they will have a meeting of heads of state. And they will make sure it works. Now, let me tell you a little story on the BRICS that illustrates the power of the BRICS. When President Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil, during the campaign he said, Brazil will leave the BRICS. The BRICS is an anti-American organization, and I will not stand for it. And the first thing I will do is to leave the BRICS. Well, not only didn't he not do that, but he hosted I don't know what it was, the 11th BRICS summit in Brasilia in November of 2019. Now, why did that happen? He was told in no uncertain terms, you cannot leave the BRICS. What is this? Brazil gets to meet once a year with some of the top leaders of the world. And that is not something we are going to give up. You will stop being president a few years from now, but Brazil will go on. And, well, Mr. Bolsonaro had to eat his words. So, what I'm trying to say is that the BRICS are here to stay. And in fact, there are 19 countries, 19, that have applied to join the BRICS. Now, some say that as a result of that, if that happens, they should change the acronym to something else. I don't think that would be a good idea. I think part of the success of the BRICS is the acronym that they have, which is very powerful.
Branding.
Yes.
We have time for maybe one more question. Who's got a desperate question? I see Raul there.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, some critics say that the principal financial institutions, particularly the World Bank and IMF, are inherently biased against the Global South, and that therefore that's an obstacle to active non-alignment. Your views on that, please?
Sure. Well, there are two things here. One of them is the question of sort of lending practices and policies, and one can argue about them in various ways, and would take a long time to elaborate fully on them. But I will say this: there is something very odd, and I've lived in Washington a number of times, and had many students and assistants and so on who applied for jobs in the IMF and in the World Bank, and the message they got. Here, everybody is welcome. We do not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation. We are extremely objective. We only want the best. So bring us your curriculum. We will interview you. And we are extremely fair. We want the best professionals from around the world, except for the head of the organization. The head of the World Bank has to be an American. And the head of the IMF has to be a European. And that's the way it is. Now, I would argue there's something deeply wrong with that approach. And it seems to me there are other reasons as well. Voting power. Belgium at one point, I don't know whether that is the case, had more voting rights in the World Bank than China did. Does that make sense to you? Probably not. So there are many issues with the way these organizations have been run, and I think some of the criticism is quite fair.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our formal program. I want to thank you, Ambassador, for a really provocative and stimulating way of thinking about things from somebody else's perspective. And that's super important, I think, for all of us, that we think about it with people's eyes, put ourselves in their shoes. Thank you also to the audience. Fantastic questions. I wish we had time for more. For those of you who are here, the ambassador will be here with us at the reception following, and we hope that you'll join us and ask some more good questions while you have that opportunity. Thank you all, and don't forget to come to Great Decisions on June 6th and Chat and Chowder, our fabulous Chat and Chowders, the next one being on June 12th.
Thank you very much.
Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you.